June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. Dawn breaks like a blade across the endless ocean. Beneath the pale horizon, the U.S. Navy's carrier decks hum with life. Engines growling, men shouting over the wind, propellers slicing the humid air. The smell of fuel, sweat, and salt merges into one as rows of Grumman F6F Hellcats crouch like predators ready to pounce. Radar screens glow aboard the USS Lexington and Yorktown. Blips appear, dozens, then hundreds, moving fast from the west. The report spreads like wildfire. Incoming raid, large formation, bearing 320 degrees. From the east, Japanese pilots rise from their own decks, young, nervous, some barely trained. Their commanders call it Operation A-Go, a decisive blow to halt the American advance. They believe this will turn the tide of war. Moments later, 500 American Hellcats tear through the clouds, blue-gray shadows slicing sunlight. Below, Japanese pilots stare upward, stunned. They had expected battle. They hadn't expected this. The roar of a mechanized storm that would change the Pacific forever. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had entered a phase of irreversible momentum. 2 years earlier, Japan had seemed invincible. Its empire stretched from Burma to New Guinea, from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. The rising sun ruled the Pacific. But by the summer of 1944, that sun was dimming fast. After the catastrophic losses at Midway, 1942, and the grinding attrition of Guadalcanal, 1942–43, Japan's fleet had lost its veteran air crews, its naval initiative, and much of its industrial edge. The United States, by contrast, had become an industrial colossus, launching new carriers every few months, training pilots on a scale Japan could no longer imagine. American factories poured out planes, ships, and ammunition with relentless precision. Each new vessel carried more advanced radar, stronger armor, and better coordination systems than the last. The U.S. strategy, shaped by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, was simple yet brutal: island hopping. Instead of retaking every Japanese-held island, Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur leapfrogged across the Pacific, capturing only those airfields and harbors that brought them closer to Japan's homeland. Each island became a springboard: Tarawa, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, each one bloodier and more decisive than the last. By early 1944, the U.S. eyes turned to the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Strategically, they were the heart of Japan's defensive perimeter. From their runways, American B-29 superfortresses could finally strike Tokyo directly. To lose the Marianas would mean opening Japan's front door to invasion. The Japanese High Command understood this with chilling clarity. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy was fractured. Old admirals debated desperate measures while younger officers still dreamed of one last, decisive battle that could shatter American morale. Their faith lay in carrier aviation, the same weapon that had brought Pearl Harbor to its knees. But the weapon was no longer the same. Japan's pilots of 1944 were not the veterans of 1941. After Midway, most had perished, replaced by barely trained rookies, some with as little as 100 flight hours. Their aircraft, the once formidable Mitsubishi A6M0, was now hopelessly outdated against the new American Hellcat. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy's Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitscher under Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet, represented the most powerful naval force ever assembled. 15 carriers, 7 battleships, dozens of cruisers and destroyers, and over 900 aircraft. They sailed westward toward the Marianas like a floating continent of steel. Behind them lay months of preparation and coordination. Radar control teams, fleet logistics, and fuel convoys stretching back thousands of miles. Ahead lay the Marianas, and the Japanese Combined Fleet, commanded by Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. The Japanese response to the American invasion was Operation Eigo, a grand plan conceived by Admiral Minichi Koga before his death, and inherited by Ozawa. Its goal: lure the American carriers into the Philippine Sea, destroy them in a single overwhelming strike, and reclaim naval superiority. But the plan rested on illusions: that Japan's pilots were still elite, that their reconnaissance would find the U.S. fleet first, and that their oil supply from the Dutch East Indies would sustain the fight. None of those illusions were true. As American Marines stormed Saipan on June 15, 1944, Ozawa's fleet moved south of the island chain, hoping to ambush Task Force 58. He commanded 9 carriers with roughly 450 aircraft. Impressive on paper, but in reality, his decks were filled with green pilots and untested crews. Fuel shortages forced many ships to ration operations. Some planes could not even complete practice sorties. Spruance, cautious but sharp, ordered Mitcher's carriers to shield the invasion forces. The U.S. fleet formed an enormous protective arc north of Saipan, radar nets humming, fighter patrols circling high above. It was a perfect balance of aggression and control, a floating fortress waiting for the storm. The stage was set. In a few days, 2 great fleets, symbols of industrial might and imperial ambition, would meet over the blue horizon of the Philippine Sea. One carried the weight of empire and tradition. The other, the power of mass production and training. The balance of the Pacific was about to be decided not by battleships or admirals, but by the young men in the cockpits above the Marianas. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa believed he could still win. He commanded what Japan called the Mobile Fleet: 9 carriers, 5 battleships, and a powerful escort force. On paper, it was formidable. In spirit, it was hollow. Operation Eigo, Japan's last major carrier plan, was born out of desperation. It promised a decisive victory in the Philippine Sea, a battle that would smash the advancing U.S. fleet and preserve Japan's outer defense line. But behind its confident words lay exhaustion. Fuel was scarce, maintenance crews were undertrained, and most pilots had never seen combat. Japan's aircraft industry was collapsing under American bombing. Engines were unreliable, parts were scarce, and airframe quality had declined. The Navy had managed to assemble 450 carrier-based aircraft and nearly 300 land-based planes from Guam, Yap, and Rota to support them. But the pilots were mostly novices, some with fewer than 40 hours of flight time. In contrast, U.S. aviators had over 500 hours on average, with combat experience stretching from Coral Sea to the Marshalls. Still, Ozawa pressed ahead. His plan was simple: lure the Americans west of the Marianas, launch massive long-range airstrikes, and destroy their carriers before they could threaten Japan's homeland. To maximize range, Japanese aircraft would fly nearly 600 kilometers to attack, pushing their limits, leaving no margin for error or return. It was a strategy built on hope, not reality. While Ozawa's carriers steamed eastward from the Philippines, the Americans had already turned the Pacific into a web of sensors. Task Force 58's carriers, Enterprise, Yorktown, Lexington, Essex, and others, were equipped with air search radar, a revolutionary advantage that changed naval warfare. U.S. radar pickets could detect incoming formations 150 miles away, giving Hellcat squadrons time to climb, position, and strike before the enemy even saw them. Japanese pilots still relied on visual spotting and radio reports, a fatal disadvantage in the vast Pacific skies. Behind the technology stood men of discipline. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, calm and methodical, commanded from his flagship USS Lexington. His task groups were subdivided, each balanced with carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and fuel ships. Coordinated fighter direction centers processed radar data, vectoring pilots with mathematical precision. When Ozawa's first wave appeared, Mitscher's radar teams already knew their altitude, bearing, and estimated time of attack. The U.S. carriers carried over 900 aircraft. About half were Hellcats, the rest dive bombers and torpedo planes. The Grumman F6F Hellcat, built for simplicity and power, was the perfect predator. Its 650 caliber machine guns and thick armor made it a flying fortress compared to the lightly built Zeros. In mock training, Hellcats could outdive, outclimb, and outshoot their opponents. By 1944, American pilots had learned not just to fight, but to hunt. The Americans also had another invisible weapon: logistics. For every Japanese carrier that struggled to refuel, the U.S. Navy maintained mobile oilers, repair ships, and supply convoys stretching across the ocean. Pilots who ditched were rescued within hours. Planes damaged in combat were replaced overnight. The Japanese had none of this. Every loss was permanent. While Ozawa's fleet maneuvered south of the Marianas, his reconnaissance failed catastrophically. Poor weather, broken radios, and inexperienced scouts gave him only vague reports. By contrast, American submarines shadowed the Japanese movements closely. On June 15th, USS Flying Fish sighted Ozawa's carriers and transmitted their position. By the 17th, Spruance knew the enemy's course almost exactly. Spruance's decision was cautious but decisive. Protect the invasion of Saipan at all costs. He ordered Mitscher's Task Force 58 to hold its position east of the Marianas, forcing Ozawa to come to them. It was a strategic masterstroke. The longer Japan's aircraft had to fly, the more fuel they'd burn, and the less time they'd have to fight. As night fell on June 18th, Japanese pilots were briefed for the next day's massive assault. They were told that victory was near, that the Americans were exhausted and unaware. But high above, American radar already tracked faint echoes far to the west. The Hellcats were ready, their engines idled through the darkness, pilots strapped in, awaiting the dawn. When morning came, it would not just be another battle in the Pacific. It would be the reckoning of Japan's naval air arm, the end of an era forged at Pearl Harbor and destroyed over the Marianas. At sunrise on June 19, 1944, the air above the Philippine Sea filled with destiny. From both sides, pilots took off into a sky that would define their generation, one shaped by discipline and experience, the other by desperation and faith. For the Americans, this was the moment they'd trained for. Months of drills, endless hours in flight simulators, carrier takeoffs under storm and darkness. Each pilot of the U.S. Navy Hellcat squadrons knew his role by instinct. Fighter direction officers guided them by radar vectors. They trusted the instruments, the mathematics, and the calm voices echoing through their headsets. Many of these aviators were young, 20 to 25 years old, but veterans of the Marshall's and Gilbert's campaigns. They had learned not just to fight, but to survive. To them, war was not about glory. It was about precision. Their aircraft, their formation discipline, their radio control, everything was part of a deadly machine. Across the horizon, the Japanese pilots were flying on hope. They were told they were the heirs of the Zero legends, the same spirit that had burned through Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea. But behind their courage lay fear and fatigue. By 1944, Japan had lost nearly all of its experienced naval aviators. The replacements, many barely out of flight school, were rushed into service after minimal training. Some had never landed on a carrier deck before. Others had only fired live ammunition during the pre-flight test. They flew with faith in their emperor and their luck, not in their instruments. In Japanese culture, death in battle was sacred. Many entered combat knowing they might not return. But in war, courage without preparation is tragedy. And the Pacific that morning was full of it. The Grumman F6F Hellcat was the industrial embodiment of American warfare, reliable, forgiving, powerful. Its 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine could climb at 3,500 feet per minute, hit 380 mph, and still take bullets without flinching. Its cockpit was protected by heavy armor. Its wings folded perfectly for carrier storage. It was a plane designed not for elegance, but for victory. Pilots loved it for one reason. It brought them home. "Built like a truck, fights like a tiger," one pilot said. It was the product of a country that could lose 10 planes and replace them by the end of the day. Japan's pride. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had been unmatched in 1941, agile, graceful, and lethal in the hands of a master. But by 1944, its age showed. Lightly armored, with no self-sealing fuel tanks, it turned every bullet hit into fire. And Japan's industry could no longer produce the superior engines or aluminum alloys that had once given it an edge. Zeros faced a brutal mismatch in technology, in tactics, and in numbers. The Americans approached aerial warfare like science. Each pilot followed radar instructions, altitude protocols, and combat patterns based on hard data. When radar picked up incoming bogies, Hellcats were vectored to intercept them at ideal altitude and sun position, ensuring they struck from advantage. Their doctrine emphasized teamwork. 2 plane sections, 4 plane divisions, constant communication. Japan still followed a samurai spirit of individual valor. Pilots were trained to fight one-on-one, relying on maneuvering skill and instinct rather than formation tactics. That might have worked against uncoordinated foes, but not against radar-guided precision. In the Marianas, valor met mathematics, and mathematics won. The cultural divide ran deeper than combat. American pilots were backed by a system that prioritized survival. Rescue craft, floating life rafts, even submarine pickups for downed airmen. Japanese pilots, in contrast, faced the sea as their grave. Few expected rescue. Many carried personal flags or letters to their families, tokens meant to be found in wreckage. For Japan, every pilot was irreplaceable. For the U.S., each was part of a vast, rotating force. This difference shaped how both sides flew. American pilots attacked with confidence. They could take risks, disengage, and return tomorrow. Japanese aviators fought with fatalism. Every mission could be their last. It was courage, yes, but also hopelessness. In that hopelessness, discipline falters. Inexperience meets panic, and panic meets the Hellcats' guns. The psychological war extended to the decks. On the USS Essex or Yorktown, deck crews worked in synchronized precision, arming, refueling, and reloading planes in under 10 minutes. Every takeoff was a heartbeat in a machine that never stopped. On Japanese carriers, chaos reigned. Limited deck crews, fuel lines stretched across open decks, bombs stacked beside aircraft. One spark, one stray round, could destroy an entire carrier. By the time the first radar contacts appeared on June 19th, the contrast between the two navies was not just tactical, it was existential. One represented a nation rising to mastery through science and logistics. The other clung to fading legend and tradition. When the Japanese launched their first wave that morning, it was not an equal contest. It was the final test of a dying doctrine against an industrial empire in full stride. The sky above the Philippine Sea was about to prove which world would endure. In earlier naval battles, Coral Sea, Midway, Santa Cruz, victory often depended on who spotted the enemy first. Human eyesight and luck dictated outcomes. But by 1944, technology had changed the rules. The U.S. fleet's radar systems, particularly the SG and SK air search radars, were the silent sentinels of the Pacific. Aboard each carrier group, trained operators watched phosphor green screens glowing in the dark. When a faint trace appeared, they tracked it, calculated its course, and relayed it to fighter direction officers. Those officers, using the new FDO plotting boards, coordinated Hellcat intercepts like chess masters moving invisible pieces across the sea. Every attack wave the Japanese launched that day was met with precision timing. At 200 miles out, U.S. radar picked them up. At 120 miles, interceptors were airborne. At 60 miles, the Hellcats were already climbing into the sun, perfectly positioned to strike. Japanese pilots never saw them coming. The Americans fought not by chance, but by algorithm. Japan's radar capabilities were primitive by comparison. Their ships carried outdated or malfunctioning sets, and few officers were trained to interpret them. Instead, they relied on scattered visual scouts, vulnerable to clouds, distance, and death. By the time Ozawa's fleet realized the Americans had found them, it was too late. The skies over the Marianas had become a one-sided arena, blind men fighting those who could see in the dark. American naval aviation doctrine in 1944 was the result of painful lessons. Midway had taught coordination. Guadalcanal had taught endurance. By the time of the Marianas, the U.S. Navy had perfected what it called the Combat Information Center, CIC, a nerve center linking radar, communications, and air operations in real time. It turned every carrier into a thinking organism, where information moved faster than the enemy could act. The Japanese, however, still operated on pre-war principles: rigid command, poor intership coordination, and minimal radio discipline. Their pilots flew bravely but independently, often losing contact with each other. In the chaos of battle, formations disintegrated. Some never found their targets. Others attacked decoys or open ocean. U.S. fighters operated in pairs, leader and wingman, rotating between attack and cover. This mutual protection concept created deadly efficiency. Japanese Zeros, lighter and faster in turns, had once exploited dogfights. But against disciplined formations with radar direction, they were swarmed and destroyed before closing range. Doctrine had shifted from instinct to systems warfare, and Japan had not kept up. Above the tactical grid of radar plots and flight paths stood two contrasting minds: Admiral Raymond Spruance and Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. Spruance was a strategist, not a gambler. Calm, deliberate, sometimes criticized for caution, he understood that the Pacific War would be won by endurance, not risk. His primary order: protect the invasion fleet. Every decision flowed from that. Methodical, patient, precise. He didn't need glory, he needed certainty. Beneath him, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded the carrier task forces. A pilot's admiral, respected and unflappable. Mitcher trusted his men and his machines. He let radar dictate moves, delegated responsibility, and believed in overwhelming firepower. His mantra was simple: find, fix, finish. On the Japanese side, Ozawa was fighting ghosts. A veteran of China and the early Pacific campaigns, he had inherited an impossible task: to win a battle with outdated equipment, untrained pilots, and dwindling fuel. He was a man of principle and loyalty, but not illusion. He knew his odds were grim, yet he followed Tokyo's command: attack at all costs. Leadership reflected philosophy. Spruance fought to preserve his strength. Ozawa fought to redeem his nation's pride. When strategy meets desperation, the outcome is written before the first bullet flies. While the two fleets maneuvered across hundreds of miles, American codebreakers at Pearl Harbor and aboard carriers intercepted fragments of Japanese radio traffic. Through magic, the U.S. had already deciphered Japan's operational patterns. They knew Eigo was coming. Spruance's fleet wasn't surprised. It was waiting. Japan had no such advantage. Their reconnaissance flights failed, and radio silence crippled their coordination. Some carrier groups launched at the wrong times. Others mistook their own units for enemy squadrons. The fog of war consumed them before the first dogfight began. Meanwhile, U.S. submarines, Kavala and Albacore, shadowed the Japanese fleet. Their reports painted a clear picture of Ozawa's movements. Every time the Japanese adjusted course, Spruance already knew. The Americans didn't just outfight Japan, they outthought it. By June 1944, both nations had transformed war into total industry. But their moral center differed. For Japan, war was an act of faith, a spiritual struggle even in defeat. For America, it was a mechanical process. Victory achieved through numbers, machines, and planning. Neither side lacked courage, but only one could sustain it. The Japanese pilots who lifted off that morning did so with hearts full of devotion. But devotion could not refuel their planes, nor replace the veterans lost at Midway. The Americans fought not with emotion, but with method. A new kind of warfare where human valor was measured in systems, circuits, and steel. By the end of that morning, both admirals had made their choices. The fleets were locked on collision course. Above the clouds, hundreds of aircraft prepared to clash in a storm of metal and flame. The stage was no longer set for balance. It was set for annihilation. Dawn, June 19th. The sea was calm, deceptively peaceful, a sheet of blue glass beneath a vast, cloudless sky. But within minutes, the Pacific would become a graveyard. At 0415 hours, the first radar pings lit up aboard the USS Lexington. Tiny green dots appeared on the Combat Information Center's screens, then multiplied. Operators leaned forward, calculating bearings, speed, altitude. The report moved up the chain swiftly. Multiple enemy raids inbound. Range 210 miles. Bearing 320 degrees. Admiral Mitcher gave the order quietly. Launch the cap. The combat air patrol engines roared to life. Carrier decks burst into motion as F6F Hellcats rolled forward one after another, launching into the golden light. Within minutes, over 200 Hellcats from Yorktown, Enterprise, Lexington, and Bunker Hill were airborne, forming layers of defense above the fleet. Far to the west, 373 Japanese aircraft were approaching, launched from Ozawa's carriers Taiho, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and several light carriers. They were divided into 4 attack waves: bombers, torpedo planes, and fighter escorts. Their mission was simple: find and destroy the American carriers. But even as they flew east, they were already hunted. At 0720, radar controllers aboard USS Lexington vectored the first Hellcat squadrons toward the incoming raids. Angels 20, bogies at bearing 320, came the calm voice over the radio. The Hellcats climbed toward the sun, throttles wide open, sunlight flashing off their wings. Moments later, they saw them. Black dots against the morning haze. The Japanese formation. Disorganized, spread out, flying too high and too slow. Most had no idea the Americans were there. Then the sky exploded. The first wave of Zeros and Judy dive bombers never had a chance. Hellcats dove from above with machine guns blazing. 650 caliber streams tearing through wings and fuselages. Pilots shouted, "Splash 1! Splash 2!" over radios as flaming debris fell into the sea below. Within minutes, radar screens showed dozens of contacts disappearing, one after another. The Japanese radio networks filled with chaos. Some pilots turned back, others pressed forward blindly, trying to break through the intercept line. But for everyone that made it through, 10 were cut down. The few that reached the American fleet faced another nightmare: anti-aircraft fire. Every battleship, cruiser, and destroyer erupted into flame and thunder. The sky turned into a cage of steel. Barrage fire from 5-inch and 40mm Bofors guns formed deadly walls of explosions. Dive bombers dove into it and vanished in blossoms of fire. Only a handful managed to drop their bombs, none scoring direct hits. The U.S. fleet remained virtually untouched. By 10:30 hours, the first wave was gone. Over 120 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, most without ever seeing their targets. Second wave. An hour later, radar screens lit up again. Another massive group inbound. Mitcher's response was instant. Launch additional cap. Hellcats scrambled again, intercepting at 60 miles. This wave, too, was annihilated. Pilots like Lieutenant Alex Vratsiu from USS Lexington became legends that day, shooting down 6 Japanese planes in just 8 minutes. Another, Lieutenant David McCampbell, recorded 7 kills during the battle. The Hellcats dominated every altitude, every approach vector. Their coordination was near perfect, their communication flawless. By noon, it was clear the Japanese air arm was being erased. Third and fourth waves, Ozawa, aboard his flagship Taiho, received confusing reports, exaggerated claims of victory from surviving pilots who believed they had hit multiple carriers. Believing success was near, he launched the remaining groups, 2 more waves totaling 150 planes. They met the same fate. By 1400 hours, the sky west of the Marianas was filled with drifting smoke and scattered wreckage. American radar operators watched as enemy traces blinked out one by one until the screens went almost blank. Out of 373 aircraft launched that morning, more than 300 were destroyed. Some were shot down. Others ran out of fuel and ditched into the sea. Only a handful limped back to Ozawa's carriers, pilots exhausted, shaken, many landing in flames. On the U.S. side, only 23 Hellcats were lost, most to anti-aircraft fire or accidents. Below decks, on the carriers, crews stood in stunned silence. They had expected a fierce struggle. Instead, it was slaughter. One radar officer aboard USS Yorktown murmured, "It was like hunting ducks. They never had a chance." The term spread across the fleet, whispered, then laughed, then officially written in the reports. The great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But behind the grim humor lay awe. They realized they were witnessing the destruction of an entire air force, one that had terrorized the Pacific for years. At sunset, the Hellcats returned home, decks lined with bullet-scarred fighters and exhausted pilots. Mitcher watched quietly from the bridge of Lexington. He knew the day's outcome was decisive, but he also knew the Japanese fleet still existed somewhere beyond the horizon. Their carriers still floated, and until they were sunk, the job was unfinished. The next day, June 20th, would finish what this one had begun. The sea was quiet again that night, eerily calm, scattered with burning oil and debris. But below the stars, the U.S. Navy prepared for one final strike. The dawn of June 20th rose over a wounded sea. The Japanese fleet, battered and scattered, drifted westward in disarray. Ozawa still had his carriers, but their decks were nearly empty. The majority of his aircraft and pilots had been lost the day before. His fleet, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, was now a collection of floating targets. Yet in Tokyo's high command, the illusion of success persisted. Reports from returning aviators, often confused or exaggerated, claimed that multiple American carriers had been sunk. Ozawa knew the truth, but he transmitted those claims anyway. To admit total defeat was unthinkable. His flagship, the Taiho, was Japan's newest and most advanced carrier, heavily armored, sleek, and symbolically vital. But even she was not immune to fate. Early that morning, the submarine USS Albacore, lurking beneath the waves, detected her on sonar. The captain fired a spread of torpedoes. One struck near the forward fuel tanks. Initially, the damage seemed contained. Damage crews sealed the compartments, and Taiho continued at speed. But gasoline vapors began leaking into the hangar deck. Ventilation fans, instead of clearing the air, spread the fumes. Hours later, a single spark ignited the ship from within. At 14:30 hours, Tai-Ho exploded in a deafening roar. The massive carrier heaved, split open, and began to sink. Over 1,600 men went down with her. Japan's most modern carrier, lost not to an air attack, but to its own internal chaos. A few hours later, another U.S. submarine, USS Kavala, spotted the veteran carrier Shokaku. Kavala closed to firing range and unleashed 6 torpedoes. 3 found their mark. Shokaku erupted into fire and rolled over, vanishing beneath the waves. It was the same ship that had launched planes against Pearl Harbor in 1941. Her loss was symbolic, the destruction of Japan's original carrier might, wiped from existence by the same kind of stealth and precision it had once mastered. Mitcher's dilemma. By afternoon, the U.S. fleet had confirmed reports of Ozawa's position, approximately 300 miles to the west. For Admiral Mitcher, it was both opportunity and risk. The distance was near the extreme range of his aircraft. To attack now meant sending his pilots out, knowing many would have to return and land in darkness. A near-suicidal challenge for carrier operations. He stood on the bridge of USS Lexington, silent for several minutes, listening to his staff debate. One officer warned, "Sir, we'll lose planes on the return." Another added, "It'll be dark before they reach us." Mitcher nodded, then spoke 6 words that entered naval history. "Launch the strike. We'll take them home." At 1600 hours, flight decks burst alive again. One after another, 216 aircraft, Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers, took off into the glowing haze of the setting sun, their silhouettes vanishing westward. It was the largest late-day carrier launch ever attempted. The dusk attack. By 1830 hours, the strike group reached the enemy. The sun hung low over the horizon, staining the clouds red. Ahead of them, faint shapes appeared. Ozawa's surviving carriers, Zuikaku, Hiyo, Junyo, and several light carriers steaming desperately west. The attack was ferocious and chaotic. Hellcats dove on the carriers, strafing decks and clearing the way for bombers. Hiyo was hit by a torpedo from a TBF Avenger, her fuel tanks erupting into fire. Within minutes, she exploded and capsized, her death witnessed by survivors from nearby ships. Other carriers took bomb hits, their decks shattered, aircraft burning. The once proud Japanese mobile fleet was reduced to wreckage scattered across the darkening sea. But victory had a price. As the American planes turned for home, the sun disappeared completely. Night fell over the Philippine Sea, and hundreds of pilots faced the most terrifying challenge of their lives. The night return. In 1944, night landings on carriers were almost impossible. There were no modern navigation systems, no night vision aids, only darkness, wind, and exhaustion. Pilots flew by dead reckoning, trying to find the faint glow of their fleet over a black ocean. Back aboard USS Lexington, Mitcher watched the horizon anxiously. He knew every minute that passed meant more lost planes. Finally, he made a radical decision, one that broke every rule of naval security. He ordered, "Turn on the lights." Instantly, the entire task force illuminated. Searchlights, deck lights, signal beacons, an enormous glowing target in the middle of enemy waters. But it worked. The returning aircraft saw the faint halo from miles away and followed it home. For the next 2 hours, the Pacific roared with the sound of landings. Some smooth, many disastrous. Planes ran out of fuel, crashed into the sea, or collided on decks slick with oil. Others ditched close enough to be rescued by destroyers. By midnight, nearly all survivors were accounted for. The fleet had lost 80 aircraft, mostly to fuel exhaustion and darkness. But the Japanese had lost 3 carriers, nearly 400 planes, and the last remnants of their experienced airmen. The end of an era. When dawn came on June 21st, the sea west of the Marianas was littered with oil slicks and debris. Smoke still rose on the horizon from burning carriers. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, was broken. Ozawa, adrift on his last surviving carrier Zuikaku, sent a single coded message to Tokyo. The mobile fleet has been destroyed. He had begun the battle with over 430 aircraft. He ended it with fewer than 35 operational planes. The Pacific sky now belonged entirely to the United States. Mitcher stood on the deck of Lexington, the wind sweeping across his face. The victory was absolute, yet his expression remained somber. He knew he had not just defeated a fleet, he had buried an era. From that night onward, no Japanese carrier would ever again threaten the Pacific. The empire that had attacked Pearl Harbor now sailed blind and powerless beneath a sky it no longer owned. The morning after the battle, June 21st, 1944, the Philippine Sea lay silent, an ocean-sized cemetery. Scattered oil slicks shimmered under the sun, dotted with fragments of metal, wood, and the faint glow of burning fuel. A few lifeboats drifted aimlessly. The smoke of 3 sunken carriers still hung on the horizon like ghosts that refused to fade. From the bridge of USS Lexington, Admiral Mark Mitcher received final reports. In 2 days of combat, U.S. forces had lost 123 aircraft, most to night recoveries and fuel exhaustion. Japan, by contrast, had lost over 500 planes, 3 carriers, and nearly 3,000 aircrew and sailors. The ratio was staggering, almost 10 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every American plane lost. The Japanese fleet was no longer a fleet, it was a shadow. When the sun rose that morning, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the battered deck of Zuikaku, staring at the ruins of what had once been the Imperial Navy's pride. Of his 9 carriers, only 3 could still steam. The rest were gone, their survivors scattered or dead. Ozawa's flagship had survived, but her flight decks were empty. Her hangars, once crowded with sleek Zeros and bombers, now echoed with the silence of failure. The few aircraft remaining were barely functional. Fuel lines leaked, engines misfired, and worse, there were no pilots left to fly them. The true damage to Japan was not the ships themselves. It was the men. Aircraft could be rebuilt, carriers could be repaired, but pilots, trained, experienced, battle-hardened, could not. The Imperial Navy had entered the battle with its last corps of veteran instructors, the remnants of the old guard from Midway and the Coral Sea. They had been sent into combat because Japan could no longer afford to keep them in classrooms. Now, they were gone, wiped out in a single weekend. In their place would come young, inexperienced flyers with minimal training, some barely knowing how to take off, let alone land on a carrier deck. Japan's once elite naval air arm, the same force that had humiliated the West in 1941 and 1942, had ceased to exist as a fighting entity. It would never recover. American intelligence analysts later wrote that after June 1944, the Japanese Navy had become a hollow shell, still afloat, but without eyes or claws. That description was painfully accurate. In Washington, when word of the victory reached the Navy Department, Admiral Ernest J. King and President Franklin D. Roosevelt immediately recognized its magnitude. The Marianas Campaign, already underway, now had full assurance of success. The seas were clear. No Japanese air fleet remained capable of contesting the invasion of Saipan, Tinian, or Guam. For Japan, the news was catastrophic. In Tokyo, the Navy Ministry received Ozawa's coded message. Short, bleak, final. All air groups have been wiped out. The fleet is without air cover. The Imperial General Staff was stunned. The decisive battle that was supposed to save the empire had instead ended its ability to defend the Pacific. The loss was not just military, it was psychological. For the first time, Japan's leadership began to confront the reality that the war could not be won. In contrast, the United States Navy had reached its peak. Task Force 58 was the embodiment of modern warfare, a seamless union of technology, logistics, and human skill. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had proven the dominance of radar-guided command, carrier air power, and industrial depth. Each ship, each pilot, each radar operator was part of a machine that worked with mathematical precision. The American fleet barely paused. Within days of the victory, it resumed airstrikes on Guam and Rota, softening defenses ahead of amphibious assaults. The U.S. Marine Corps continued to advance across Saipan, where fierce ground battles raged against desperate Japanese defenders. By July, the island fell, sealing the fate of the Marianas and bringing the war to Japan's doorstep. With the Marianas captured, American engineers immediately began constructing B-29 superfortress airfields. From these islands, for the first time, the U.S. could launch direct bombing raids on Tokyo, 1,500 miles away. The Pacific had effectively become an American lake. The loss of the Marianas struck Japan harder than any single defeat before it. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, chief of the combined fleet, described it bluntly. "Our sea power has been broken. Our air power is exhausted. The enemy will come next to the homeland." In Tokyo, the government attempted to suppress the scale of the disaster. Official communiques spoke vaguely of heavy fighting and temporary setbacks. But rumors spread quickly among civilians and soldiers alike. The invincible Imperial Navy, the pride of the nation, had vanished in 2 days. Confidence in ultimate victory began to crumble. Among surviving pilots who reached Japan, morale was shattered. Many spoke of radar-controlled enemy fighters that appeared out of nowhere, of skies filled with invisible death. One pilot reportedly said, "It was not a battle. It was execution." The Battle of the Philippine Sea had ended, but its echo rolled across the Pacific like a distant thunderclap. For America, it was triumph. For Japan, it was the beginning of the end. The Empire's fleets could still sail, but they would never again control the skies. When the Battle of the Philippine Sea ended, the Pacific War entered a new age. For Japan, the horizon darkened beyond repair. For the United States, the path to victory had never been clearer. The annihilation of Ozawa's air fleet created an irreversible vacuum. Without carrier aviation, Japan could no longer project power beyond the coastlines of its islands. The American carriers, now unopposed, became floating fortresses that could strike anywhere, anytime. The Pacific, once vast and contested, turned into an open highway for U.S. operations. Within weeks, the American flag was raised over Saipan. By late July, Tinian and Guam followed. Each island, once a fortress in Japan's defensive ring, became a forward base for U.S. bombers and supply lines. From these new airfields, B-29 superfortresses began launching long-range raids over the Japanese mainland. What Tokyo had once called the outer wall of defense was now a launchpad for destruction. The loss of the Marianas did more than shift territory. It shattered Japan's war psychology. For the first time, the home islands themselves were within direct bombing range. Japan's cities, its industries, and its sense of invulnerability were suddenly exposed to the sky. In the aftermath, the Imperial Navy tried to rebuild. Admirals drew up plans to train new pilots, repair damaged ships, and reorganize surviving units. But the raw materials of war, oil, aluminum, time, were gone. Japan's once vast supply routes had been severed by American submarines. Fuel tankers rarely reached the home islands. New aircraft sat useless on runways for lack of aviation fuel. Training programs shrank from months to mere weeks. Young recruits practiced in obsolete planes, often with wooden propellers and no live ammunition. By late 1944, desperation replaced doctrine. Admiral Ozawa, spared after the battle, remained a loyal officer but a haunted man. He submitted his reports honestly, stating that Japan's naval air power was destroyed beyond recovery. Tokyo's high command, unwilling to face reality, still spoke of one last decisive battle to turn the tide. But history had already moved on. The U.S. Navy pressed forward relentlessly. Task Force 58, later reorganized as Task Force 38 under Admiral William Bull Halsey, swept across the western Pacific, striking the Palaus, the Philippines, and Okinawa. Each campaign was larger, faster, and more devastating than the last. The new American strategy relied on overwhelming mobility. Carriers launched hundreds of aircraft in coordinated waves, while radar and code breaking kept them one step ahead of Japan's every move. What had begun as a contest of fleets had now become a rolling, unstoppable offensive. In October 1944, 4 months after the Philippine Sea, Japan attempted its last grand naval stand at Leyte Gulf. But without trained aviators, it was a hollow echo of its former strength. The few remaining carriers were used as decoys, empty shells to draw American fire. The real fight was waged by battleships and cruisers, but even they were crushed. The once mighty Imperial Navy ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The Turkey Shoot of June had not just destroyed aircraft, it had erased Japan's future in modern warfare. Inside Japan, the defeat triggered ripples through society. Reports from the front were censored, but returning sailors whispered the truth. Of skies filled with invisible enemy planes, of Hellcats descending like machines of fate. Survivors described the Americans as fighting ghosts guided by lightning. That lightning was radar, but to the men who faced it, it seemed supernatural. Morale in the fleet collapsed. Training bases fell silent. For the first time, some officers began to speak privately of surrender, an unthinkable word just months earlier. The Emperor's advisors tried to hide the scale of loss. Officially, the battle was called a strategic withdrawal. Unofficially, it was the end of Japanese naval aviation, a truth too large to admit. Deprived of skilled pilots and modern planes, Japan began turning to new, desperate tactics. By late 1944, the concept of kamikaze, suicide attacks, took hold. It was not born of fanaticism alone, but of necessity. When training could no longer produce experienced aviators, the only weapon left was sacrifice. The seeds of that grim doctrine were planted in the ashes of the Philippine Sea. Meanwhile, the Americans learned the opposite lesson. Precision, patience, and planning could win wars faster than fury. The Hellcat had proven that victory was no longer about bravery alone. It was about systems that multiplied human ability. The war had evolved from men versus men to machines versus nations. The Battle of the Philippine Sea effectively secured America's command of the Pacific. From then until the end of the war, the U.S. Navy faced no serious challenge on the open ocean. It became a conveyor of invasion, carrying Marines, bombers, and supplies toward Japan's heart. For the Japanese Empire, the defeat at the Marianas was not a single loss. It was the point of no return. Every island that fell afterward, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and eventually the homeland itself, was a direct consequence of that summer's two-day storm. In every naval academy today, strategists still study the battle not just as a military engagement, but as the moment the age of air power truly began, when the aircraft carrier replaced the battleship as the ultimate symbol of command. When the fires over the Philippine Sea finally burned out, the ocean was calm again. But beneath that calm, history had shifted. Empires fall quietly, not in explosions, but in realization. For Japan, that realization began here, In the wake of 500 lost planes and the silence of the Marianas sky. The end of one sky, the beginning of another. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was more than a military victory. It was the turning of an age, the moment when human courage met the full force of industrial intelligence and lost. For centuries, wars had been fought by will, by instinct, by the skill of the warrior's hand. In June 1944, that changed forever. The skies over the Marianas marked the birth of a new kind of warfare, one ruled by machines, guided by circuits, measured by radar pulses and plotted on glowing screens. For the first time, victory was not decided by who saw the enemy first, but by who understood the battlefield as a system. The Americans had built that system, and the world would never be the same again. For Japan, the battle was the shattering of illusion. The empire that had once dominated the Pacific discovered that bravery alone could not stop mathematics, nor could faith outrun fuel and steel. Its pilots fought with honor. Their deaths were not meaningless, but they belonged to a past that technology had already erased. For the men who fought on both sides, the memory lingered. American pilots returned to their carriers exhausted, faces streaked with oil and salt, aware that they had destroyed an entire generation of opponents. Japanese survivors, adrift in the sea, looked up at the sky that had once been theirs and found it silent, a sky they would never again command. From that silence rose a new order. The aircraft carrier became the supreme instrument of power. Nations learned that control of the air meant control of the earth below. The Pacific War would continue through Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Hiroshima, but its outcome was already written in the smoke over the Marianas. The Turkey Shoot, as sailors called it, was more than slaughter. It was transformation. In that brief, blazing span of 2 days, the modern age of warfare began, and the age of the warrior ended.